Stars, take me. I thought myself to be a learned man, but this completely overturns everything we know about intelligent life and origin of species. To think that such an amazing mix of animalistic and humanoid features could live in this world. Look at the way he... So... fluffy. It is indeed fascinating, Mr. Storm, but I'm more concerned about the fact that he looks a lot like one of those robed ghouls that attacked us in the past months. Maybe he knows something about these raids. We should question him. And I am more concerned with the fact that you are talking about me as if I'm not present in the room, Northman. Or, in case of your companion there, as if I'm some kind of curiosity to be dissected on the table. By the... you can speak our language. Captain Yarohin, why haven't you mentioned anything? Do not lay blame on your sea commander, Northman. I may have deceived him by pretending to only barely understand your tongue, because I could not believe that Outlanders could understand our own. I believed it to be lie of some kind, but judging by the smell of your reaction, you are just as surprised as I was when I heard your people talk for the first time. For to me, you were the ones who spoke as I do, some different words here and there, but same otherwise. Hard to believe that two groups of people develop the same language despite never meeting each other and being separated by an ocean. But here it is, an undeniable proof right in front of me. Very well then, we started off on the wrong foot, so let's back up and begin again. Wouldn't you agree? I am Arius Erigen, Lord Governor of these lands, and I welcome you to the town of Fringid, Mr. Rajal, warrior and commander of the Nahri, the scouts of our people. Then we welcome you on behalf of entire Metzaca, Commander Rajal. Now, please take a seat and let us talk. Captain, please be so kind and get someone from the camp to bring us food and some drinks. Thank you. Now then, my friends, if you do not mind, I have many questions. This is, like you noticed yourself, the first time we met one of your people after all. I will do my best to answer them, Governor Arius. But before that happens, you must know that I have not traveled all this way here just to talk. I arrived with a request and an offer, and after you're done asking your questions, you will hear them out. Very well, you have my word. Now then, let's start with something simple. Who are you? Not as a person yourself, but as a people. Are you native to these islands? We are the Tiharan, builders, hunters, and chosen of earth and sky, or so we thought back home when it was still a home. Alas, it is now lost to us. All we are now are remnants, scattered and forced to flee our once prosperous cradle into these scorching islands. I'm sorry to hear that. What happened? We do not know. Our elders say that our old homeland was a large continent southeast of here, and it was a dry and warm place, covered in sand and rocks, and divided by canyons and mountains. But amongst all that dust, there were rivers, white, powerful, and fueled by seasonal rains. They gave life both to the drylands and to our people. But one day, over 200 cycles ago, something changed. Rain clouds carried less water, and the rivers became smaller, shallower. It was not an issue at first, but the drought persisted. Year by year, there was less and less rain, until finally it stopped raining altogether. The rivers dried out, and with them fields and pastures. The land died, and with it our people. Our king and his lunar priests tried to maintain order, but it was too late. Our nation fell to infighting, as one Tiharan turned on another for scraps of food and few drops of water. Eventually, even deepest wells started to dry out, so the remnants of our people did the only thing they could. 60 or so cycles ago, they boarded their galleys and sailed off in all directions, seeking a place that was not empty wasteland. Most vanished into the sea. Some, like the people who founded our town, settled here or on other islands. But we're no longer single people. It's every Tiharan for themselves now. I don't know what to say. Please accept my deepest sympathies. I do not need them. I was born here on these islands, so I know nothing about old homeland, aside from tales of our elders. Very well, but you actually also answered my second question there. I wanted to ask you how long your people have been here, but now I know, which is not good. You see, we met some of your people some time ago, undead ones, and according to one of my experts, they seemed to be way older than 60. Is it possible that some of your people explored these islands before your exile brought you here? I do not know. It is probable, but only our elders could answer that, and even their knowledge is unsure at best. Not many records from before survived our migration. I see. More and more mysteries then. But I think I heard enough for now. There will be time for plenty more questions later. Now then, that request you mentioned. What is it? It is about our people. My people, to be precise. When we settled here, we saw little in terms of other people. A lot of monsters, but according to our elders, they were nothing like beasts that roamed drylands back home. In recent years, though, we have spotted more and more ships sailing across these waves. Most ignored us, for our town is deep inland and not visible from the sea, but some started to land on our island. Small green ones, tall ones with long limbs, ones that look like you but smaller. We hoped they might be friendly, but most either fled when we tried to approach them or attacked our people. Lately, their incursions became more violent and better organized. Entire companies attacked us and started kidnapping my people. My Nahri and myself tried to stop them, but we were ambushed. They killed a lot of my kin and captured the rest. I barely managed to flee, but now I am disgraced. I must recover them, and not just them, but all of our kidnapped people. I know where they have been taken, to another island south of here, but I can't recover them on my own. So when I spotted other ships, whose crew was not hostile, I decided to try my luck there. That is why I'm here, to ask for help. For if I return home without my warriors, I am as good as dead. Not a tall order to ask of someone you have just met, don't you think? But then again, I assume you would not ask if the situation wasn't truly desperate. What do you think, Mr. Storm? Should we help this man? That depends. I admit that it would be beneficial for us to have some allies here in the archipelago, but we can't just blindly charge into a fight without knowing who we fight against. So tell me, Mr. Rajal, those enemies who kidnapped your people, do you have any clue who they were? They're clearly more organized than bandits if they can pull off a naval attack, and they need to have a ship, or even a few of them, to conduct it. Were they wearing uniforms of some kind? Anything distinctive? No, they were a rabble of small green-skinned ones, but the ships they came on, they all sailed under a single flag, a red one, with darker red star in the middle. Oh, stars, damn it all. Crimson Star Company. Your Highness, we should avoid any interactions with them, especially hostile ones. We cannot afford to antagonize the city-state of Crid, not if we want to ever trade with the continent again. We have to decline. No, we do not. It's good that it's Cridians, Mr. Storm. They are the ones who drafted the treaty that divided these islands, and according to this very document, this here is our sphere of influence. Which means that by kidnapping Tehran people, they are kidnapping my people. We have all the right to act. They will not see it like this, and so won't the council back in Metzaca. You may be Lord Governor, but you still need to actually present yourself before them, so they can vote to approve any military operations away from the island. To hell with the council. By the time we get back to Metzaca and convince them to agree to this plan, it will be too late. You know yourself what Crimson Company does with captives. We must act now. But nothing, and I know how to resolve it. One of the scouts said that there are over a dozen of old trade barges in harbour. Frostlings have not destroyed them, so we can use them to transport some of our men to that island. So, Galladay and I will go, and you, Mr. Storm, you will take half of the force, go back to Metzaca and speak to the council on my behalf. Either convince them to support my plan, or just stall them until I get back. Your Highness, this is wildly irresponsible. The council will be furious, not to mention that I'm sworn to protect you, so you can't just ask me to leave your side. I can. Believe me, you will be protecting me in Muzaka as well, but not against swords and arrows, but against something far more vicious, angry politicians. And besides, you hate sailing, so I'm offering you a way out of it. Now, no complaints, we know what to do, so let's get to it. Mr. Rajal, I'd say you got yourself a deal. Let's go get your people back. When Arius Erigen and his few remaining supporters first came to Metzaca, their arrival was not really met with much hope or even much interest. Everyone believed that the fallen prince would not change anything on the chaotic island, and so most people never really bothered to learn much about him. But now, over a year later, this situation turned almost completely around. So much, in fact, that when Metzacan army sent a message back to the city that it was going to march on to recapture Frostling-occupied settlement of Fringid, some people departed to the south even before the news of victory reached them, trusting the last Erigen to deliver results, just like he did in previous months. Which meant that, mere few weeks after Frostlings who destroyed Fringid were wiped out, first groups of new colonists were already spotted near the town, hoping to make use of the free real estate this now abandoned settlement provided. Between frozen climate and mass grave of previous inhabitants, mere few hundred meters away from Fringid, it was not really the most hospitable place, but many preferred to try their luck there anyway, if only to escape still overcrowded Metzacan streets. Granted, they were not as overcrowded like they were several months ago, but with recent reopening of the port, even more people started to arrive from the old continent, hoping to flee the increasing tensions between elves and goblins, so to many people, even a ghost town like Fringid seemed safer and more welcoming than anything back home. Especially since there was money to be made here, and it was money that could not be earned anywhere else. For after Arius and his men brought Sir Caris back into the fold, they realized that, despite lying in the middle of freezing magical frostlands, the town was actually able to support itself rather well, and required almost no supplies from the capital. For, as Continentals learned, the frostlands here were different to the ones back home. On the old continent, areas struck by Archmage's spell were nothing but frozen wastelands where all life withered and died in a matter of minutes if left without support. Here, on the other hand, the snowy hills and forests seemed to teem with life, as packs of animals roamed the land and odd plants seemed to grow in small pockets of open ground. As Elves of Sir Caris proved, with a bit of stubbornness it was possible to even farm the Frostlands and earn good living by selling fruits of this magically infused land, simply because they were not available anywhere else, and even now, first barrels of the so-called snow wine were travelling back to the continent, where they would surely become wildly popular in the coming years, even though that the drink itself had nothing to do with actual wine, and was more of a homemade moonshine brewed from odd, white berries that grow in cold forests of the Frostlands. Why this land was so dramatically different to the one back home no one could really tell though. Some suspected that underground magma flows warmed the earth and enabled the plants to grow. Others believed that all these magical springs that dotted the archipelago were affecting the land in some unknown but beneficial way. Still, no one knew for sure, and so for now at least, people of Metzaca could only speculate. And, for the first time since the city was founded, some of them actually had a bit of free time to do so, because, thanks to earlier expeditions and hard work of city workers, the capital was finally dragged out of the Dark Ages and brought into shining modernity with introduction of first steam engines. Of course, such machines were nothing new, with first experimental ones being introduced over half a century before, but up until now the colony had no knowledge on how to build them and no means to do so. After all, most engine blueprints were a closely guarded secret, held under lock and key by Artificers Guild, an organization that, officially at least, had no presence in the colonies. Unofficially, however, that weird, haunted carriage that Arius and his men explored some time ago was a proof that artificers took at least some interest in this archipelago, and though the ones sent here met an untimely end, their notes and schematics allowed Metzacan craftsmen to reverse engineer their machines, and soon, first steam-powered factory that could produce even more engines sprang up from the ground in colonial capital, ready to finally bring this backwater island into modern times. And as one might expect, the demand for the new machines was immense. Recent introduction of undead workers to the city meant that a lot of jobs were taken over by unthinking, unfeeling undead who cared little for poor workplace conditions and back-breaking labor. Right now, it was not uncommon to see skeletons or zombies mindlessly sweeping the streets, or putting furniture together in carpentry manufactories, or even serving as moving, tireless hammers in foundries. Some tasks, of course, were too difficult to mass reanimated shamblers, but that's where ghouls came in, walking in sewer maintenance or, to surprise of many people in the streets, in law enforcement. After all, a policeman who needed no sleep was a perfect fit for long night shifts, and soon patrols walking the streets started to look even more pale than usual night watch. But still, the main economic benefit for the city was in mindless reanimated corpses who, as Goblin Republics found out in recent decades, paired extremely well with steam engines. The machines allowed for a certain degree of automation and served as a base for assembly lines of various goods. Walking said lines, however, was a mind-numbing, exhausting and dangerous task. One wrong move and a careless walker could lose a limb in the nearest turbine, but with skeletons and zombies that was no longer an issue. You could place them in one spot on the line, and they would spend the next year in the very same place, performing the same boring task over and over again, assuming of course that the engines were working all the time as well. All that meant that productivity skyrocketed, as new factories would soon be able to produce goods almost entirely without stopping, and at the same time it meant some changes for the unskilled laborers, who now found themselves in a new reality. Some, of course, retained their jobs, for both undead and machines required regular maintenance, while some tasks still had to be performed by someone with even minimal intelligence. But others could now leave dark and stuffy workshops of Metzaca and try their luck at some other career, and since there was no shortage of jobs both inside and outside of the city, it only meant further financial benefits for everyone involved. It wasn't long before first fruits of this industrial improvement became visible, with even more wealth flowing into colonial coffers. But the real sign of new age for the city manifested itself in the harbour, where, thanks to liberal use of undead workforce and some of the new machines, the shipwrights were capable of building a frigate within a month, something that was unthinkable a mere year before. Shortly after that, though, the message from Lord Governor arrived, detailing his victory in Fringid, but that was just a small part of the message, and the rest of Arius's report quickly overshadowed mechanical marvels, regardless of their obvious usefulness. For the prince, apparently, encountered something far more interesting than machines. A completely new, previously unknown race of intelligent, civilized beings that were never spotted by anyone from the continent before. These people called themselves Tigrans, but were quickly dubbed Tigrans by population of Metzaca, who had little patience for outlandish names, not to mention that the name was more than fitting considering their appearance. At first, many believed that these beings were native inhabitants of these poorly explored lands, but as it turned out, they arrived from somewhere else as well, an unknown, arid continent somewhere to the southeast, that was now completely uninhabitable, which forced the Tigrans to look for another place or die out there due to lack of resources. So it's no wonder that, when those news reached Metzaca, they were greeted with both curiosity and, perhaps the most common response, bewilderment, for, let's face it, reading about civilization of intelligent cat people seems like a weird joke. And yet, more and more messages from the south confirmed the existence of these beings, or at the very least one of them, which also joined Arius's army for some reason, and soon the doubts started to dissipate. Unfortunately, though, the ones curious about these newly discovered neighbors had very little news to work with, simply because Metzacans had access only to a single member of this race, and he, just like Lord Governor himself, was now out of reach. And this part of the report grabbed even more attention than discovery of a new civilization, at least in certain crowds, namely the people who ran the Metzacan Council. Most of them were people who were established in the city long before Arius arrived, but deferred to him to most military matters, since he had some experience with it. Now, however, they were furious, for by splitting his force into two groups and sailing away from the island, Lord Governor broke one of the rules he signed when the council granted him his new position, which stated that without their approval he could not take any troops away from the island, a rule set in place to prevent the exiled prince from sailing back to the continent and throwing himself at Ishizawa's new republic. So, needless to say, the councillors were not overly pleased to learn that the rules were so openly ignored. Some, of course, argued that Arius acted in good faith and only embarked on this mission away from Metzaca because he hoped to use this opportunity to gain favour with the Tigrans, and the colony could surely use some actual allies close to home. And while most councillors agreed with such reasoning, Governor Gerstein nonetheless called for general meeting, for such transgression simply couldn't be ignored. And so, it fell to Mr. Storm to travel back to Metzaca and represent his longtime student in the court. And while the message sent to the sorcerer was written in a very insistent way, the councillors still had to wait a little longer. Fringid might have been captured, but some parts of the southern Frostlands were still not safe, and so the army, now cut in half by Arius's reckless expedition, still had some work ahead of it before being able to return to the capital. Said walk, however, proved to be a bit more complicated than anyone could initially expect. Following clues provided by scouts and local hunters and travelers, Mr. Storm managed to catch wind of yet another group that camped somewhere alongside the road between Metzaca and Fringid, and now, with the road being in use again, that group started to supply itself by robbing travelers and merchants moving between towns. Luckily for Metzacans though, these particular robbers were not really interested in killing, and as long as people handed over their goods to the weird, masked warriors, they were usually left alone. But those very masks also made everyone afraid of them, including Mr. Storm himself, because they could mean only one thing: Imperial monster hunters. Hailing from the greatest nation in the world, occupying a large continent in the north, these warriors were financed by imperial government and, unlike most of its citizens, were allowed to operate outside of its borders. Officially, their objective was in their name, to hunt dangerous monsters that roamed the world, and for many years they did just that, but in recent decades, with most magical creatures in the old world being exterminated to the last, their job changed dramatically. Instead of hunting dangerous wildlife, these men roamed the lands away from the Empire, just like imperial privateers scoured the seas, and simply caused chaos anywhere they went in any way possible to undermine other countries. Sometimes they served as mercenaries, sometimes they acted as bandits, but most importantly, they were constantly sending messages back to their homeland in the north, so that imperial government could know as much as possible about other nations. And although everyone knew that these men were always up to no good, no one really did anything about them, out of fear of their powerful overlord and its mighty fleets. And so, when Mr. Storm's newly organized army, that included both knights and trebuchets as they were too unwieldy to pack on Arius's transport barges, finally tracked down the hideout of these imperial troublemakers, they were understandably apprehensive about attacking them, as such action would no doubt have repercussions in the future. But, consequences or not, robbing civilians was not acceptable, and so when Metzacan forces found Imperial facility, housed in some old colonial manor, they surrounded it, and Mr. Storm took some of his men to try and convince the hunters to leave. One can only imagine their surprise when they realized that the hunters were not just here to cause mischief, but to actually perform their official job and eliminate dangerous magical creatures. In fact, this group went even beyond their job description and somehow tamed a few dozen bird-like beasts, griffins, which some of the hunters were now riding. And in any other circumstance it would have been an amazing, glorious sight, but mere moments after spotting these griffin riders, it became obvious that Imperial agents were not willing to even let Mr. Storm talk. Instead, the Sky Riders rushed forward, their beasts shrieking as they closed distance towards Metzacans with breathtaking speed. Taken aback, Colonial Sorcerer tried to stop them, but it was already too late for any kind of negotiations. And though it was clear that they wanted to lure Metzacans to come to them, the hunters could not ignore presence of siege artillery, and so, despite their low numbers, began to advance forward, using buildings of the manor complex as cover on their approach. That, of course, did not make this fight any easier for colonial soldiers who painfully learned that attacking monster hunters on their own turf is always a dangerous proposition. Entire area around the manor was littered with traps which slowed down their approach, but it was a necessary trade-off to avoid heavy casualties. Sadly, the knights, impetuous and eager to prove themselves once more, were not as patient, and some of them ran straight into hidden spikes and holes, and lost some of their men and horses even before the fight began. And as Metzacans slowly took defensive positions to prepare for approaching Imperials, the hunters crept even closer and launched some first attacks, bombarding colonial archers with crossbow bolts. Nearby, Griffon riders soon passed their comrades and made a dash for the trebuchets to silence them, but were intercepted by the pikemen, who, to complete surprise of the flyers, appeared to be completely invincible. The line of Griffons crashed into them, hoping to use their sheer momentum to break their ranks and push them aside, but the pikes stood strong as an island in the ocean and pushed the beasts back instead. The rider who led the charge suddenly found himself surrounded by angry spear points and tried to smash his way back to his men with his massive hammer, but it was as if he was trying to tear down a mountain with a toothpick, for the pikemen had not only their weapons and training on their side, but Mr. Storm's magic as well, and that magic now formed a protective barrier around them, one that made even most devastating attacks almost completely inconsequential, allowing these militiamen, most of whom had no military experience just a single year ago, to not only hold their own, but to push the flying beasts back. On the other side of the manor, the knights and handgunners descended upon a poorly armed group of warriors, ones who were probably taken by surprise and had no time to don their armor, and dispatched them with no issues. But on the left, situation suddenly took a turn for the worse. The hunters used the fact that the pikemen were busy with their flying comrades and rushed towards the archers, switching their crossbows to massive two-handed swords which decimated ranks of colonial skirmishers. Mr. Storm tried to help, but he and his assistants were still tired after casting that defensive incantation, and their attack turned out to be almost completely useless. But at this point, with right flank cleared up, the rest of the army could fold in and provide support, and the knights soon arrived to ride down the last remaining hunters, ending the battle right there and then. The manor was secured, although sadly not without heavy casualties amongst the archers, but it was not the end of surprises for one day, for as the soldiers moved in to secure the manor complex, they found several dozen more cages, which held even more griffons inside them. Griffons that were apparently already broken and tamed, and as some of the cages were cautiously opened, the beasts inside simply walked out of them and acted as obedient as a horse, although no one in the entire force dared to try and fly on one of them. But other cages held something even weirder. At a glance, they seemed to be filled with rocks, but as soon as one of Mr. Storm's apprentices got close to one of them, said rocks suddenly sprang to life and formed a weird, floating rock creature that was glowing from inside with magical energy. Surprised, the mages realized that what they had in front of them were elf elementals, purely magical beings that were, according to historical records, driven to extinction over half a millennium ago. Some of the greatest sorcerers knew how to create such beings, but this knowledge was a closely guarded secret, so their presence here, away from high-ranking members of Mages Guild, could only mean that these particular elementals were not summoned, but native to the archipelago, which, in turn, made the fact that they were tamed and obedient, just like the Griffons, even more surprising, and soon Mr. Storm with his students let them all out and, for a lack of better word, adopted them in order to learn their secrets that must have been tied to these magical springs that dotted the island, for every single elemental had a single piece of magically infused rock lodged inside of their bodies. The possibilities such knowledge opened were too numerous to count, and the soldiers had to force Mr. Storm away from the creatures and remind him that he was called to go back to Muzaka for the hearing. And so, with their new inhuman friends in tow, the army finished up their sweep of the lands around Fringid and marched north to face beasts far worse than anything from history books, a bunch of angry politicians. Ladies and gentlemen of the council, I implore you, please calm yourselves. Yes, the situation we're in is not a pleasant one, but we can't just sit here and scream over each other. If we want to reach any kind of consensus on the matter, we need to calm ourselves and discuss our options.
There is nothing to discuss.
By taking his army away from the island without approval from us, our Lord Governor broke the treaty he signed with our council when he arrived here. And for that he must answer like any other lawbreaker.
Yes, you have voiced your opinion on the matter several times already, Mr. Nakir. Now please.
That is Lord Nakir to you, elf. You may be in charge for now, but never forget that you are just a son of some merchant family, while I'm the highest-ranking noble here. So take care how you talk to your betters.
Of course, Mr. Nakir. However, let me remind you that the notion of nobility no longer means anything, at least as far as titles go. You may have your lands inside and outside of the city, and more wealth than an average citizen, but that does not make you any better or worse than any other person in this room or in the streets, at least not according to our law.
Our law? The Cridians just imposed their own rules on us without even asking. We might as well be their colony right now.
That was the only way we could avoid being annexed by the new Southern Republic, Mr. Nakir, and I dare to say that accepting this new system of council-led leadership was better than remaining a backwater forgotten by our own motherland. At the very least now, our position in the world and the livelihood of our people are improving for the first time in decades.
And by what cost? By letting peasants and fishmongers dictate our rules? Such petty people should remain in their place and work, instead of aiming for positions they're simply not trained to take. But I should not be surprised that you, of all people, would support our Lord Governor. He is, after all, a lowborn just like you are, and no, do not dare to say that his father was the king. Saron was born on the streets of Mulgar and would remain a mercenary, a job he was far more suited to, if not for some bizarre set of circumstances that allowed him to take down the Archmage and the mass insanity that apparently gripped our people afterwards, when they decided to give him the throne. But that is all besides the point. You say that we have new laws, and even though they're a stain on our history, I have no other option but to agree with that for now. But in that case, everyone, especially our peasant Lord Governor, should be bound by said laws. So as I said at the beginning, there is nothing to discuss. We should summon him immediately and force him to take responsibility for this betrayal of trust by either demoting him or outright throwing him in jail.
Very well, Mr. Nakir. Your opinion has been noted and everyone in the room has heard it. Again. But there are other groups whose representatives have a right to vote their opinions as well before we vote, so... Yes, Mr. Storm? What is it?
Pardon me, Mr. Gerstein, but am I not allowed to speak here? After all, I brought you this news, so I may provide an alternative viewpoint.
You certainly could, Mr. Storm, but you are also a known associate of Mr. Erigen, which means your opinion, valuable as it is, will no doubt be biased, and we cannot have that in this discussion, for we not only decide the fate of your student, but of the entire region as well. So you are welcome to stay, but please refrain from speaking for now. Now then, who is next? Ah, Miss Corvin of the Mercantile faction. The room is yours. Thank you, Mr. Gerstein. Now, let me start by saying that Lord Erigen's arrival was not met with much optimism, but over these past year and a half I'd say he has proven himself to, at the very least, be a competent military commander, and a man who is working for the benefit of not just himself and his closest associates, but also the rest of the region. He could have just taken up residence in the governor's mansion and remained there being useless, but instead he took it upon himself to take our small and disorganized forces and improve them up to the point where they were able to re-establish our control over the island.
It's almost as you believe it's safe outside of the walls now. He might have taken down some of the roving bands, true, but there are still plenty of dangers there, especially since remaining bands of brigands, like those blasted White Ravens, became far better organized. And as for Lord Governor rebuilding the army, let us not forget that he spent money from our treasury to do this. So now, by taking this army away from the island, he basically robbed us. And don't even get me started on his additional expenses. Or do I need to remind you that he handed over 2 months of entire colonial income to that witch that follows him around now?
It seemed like a questionable decision at first, true, but Miss Pireni proved herself to be immensely useful, and right now the money spent on hiring her already pays dividends. You might not have noticed from your carriage, but the streets of Metzaca are much cleaner now that we have undead workforce in the garbage disposal. They're cleaning trash, cleaned the streets, and even ensured that our sewer systems work well for the first time in years. So in other words, they do all the dirty, menial work no one else wants, which makes our lives that much easier. But back to Lord Governor. Yes, his actions have been a bit erratic since he arrived here, there's no denying that. But there's also no denying that his contributions finally broke Metzaca out of economic deadlock it's been for years. And now, if Mr. Storm's story about making friends with those cat people is true, then I'd say it's worthy of our attention, and Mr. Erigen's little detour could only help us even more in the long run. Besides, not the entire army was taken away, so it's not like he left us completely without protection.
So that is how you see it? That he only broke the law a bit, so we should just sweep the issue under a rug? And I don't even want to think about your earlier argument about his actions being profitable, because you basically admitted that mercantile faction is willing to overlook all manner of injustice if the money is right. This is what happens when commoners with no honor and sense of justice are allowed to rule over anything. The noble faction will not stand for this.
All right, that is enough. We'll be here all week at this rate, so we may as well vote. But I must agree with Mr. Nakir on one thing. We cannot just leave this unanswered. So here are the options. We will vote for either recalling Mr. Erigen right now and imprisoning him for breaking the law, though allow me to also add that we have no real way of enforcing it. Or we will send him a message and wait for him to return himself, so that he may defend himself in front of the council, and that way we'll both recognize his efforts and give him the benefit of a doubt. So, representatives who vote for option 1, raise your hands. Thank you. Representatives who vote for option 2, raise your hands. Thank you. It is settled then. Option number 2 wins 5-4. I will send the messenger bird immediately. This session is now over.
So the greed wins once again, but you're all making a huge mistake and set up a dangerous precedent. He broke the law once, and he'll no doubt do so again, and mark my words, we will all pay for it in the end.
And so, Mr. Storm survived the political avalanche and was sent back into the wilds to continue operations to make the island of Metzaca safer, while in the city itself, politicians were creating worse and worse possible scenarios for consequences of Arius' misbehavior. But what was the fallen prince doing in this time? Well, to be fair, if the councillors knew, they would no doubt become even more angry, because while they were busy worrying about geopolitical implications, Arius, together with Galadea, Rajal and the rest of his army, enjoyed a pleasant cruise to the south, and after a few months in and around frozen Fringir, spending a few weeks sunbathing on decks of transport barges did wonders to morale of colonial soldiers. That rest, however, came to an abrupt end when an observer from the Unicorn spotted a distant dark shape on the horizon, an island on which, apparently, Rajal's fellow Tigrans were held captive. And it certainly was a foreboding island, covered in ash and rivers of molten lava and surrounded by sharp, jagged rocks. What's more, just like Surkaris and Tigran settlement to the north, the island itself was pretty much a single mountain, which once again made everyone afraid about the possibility of a dormant volcano lying right underneath their feet. But there was no time to dwell on such dangerous possibilities, for as soon as the fleet got closer to the island, the Unicorn sailed on ahead to look for the prison camp where Rajal's warriors were held, and returned mere few hours later with news about a lighthouse and a small dock built in a secluded cove. Dock operated mostly by a bunch of goblins and, more importantly, a number of Tigran slaves. That was enough for Arius to make a decision. He brought the fleet to stop and ordered most of his soldiers to disembark, while sending Galadea and her shamblers several kilometers down the shore so that they could act as a flanking force and also block any escape routes the goblins inside the prison camp wished to use. At the same time, Unicorn and the 2nd Frigate sailed towards the cove and blocked it from the sea, training their ballistas on the shore and waiting to stop anyone who would try to run away by sea. And the goblins took one look at colonial force, realized just how dreadfully outnumbered and outclassed they were, and threw themselves in all directions, hoping to flee before being surrounded. But Arius' plan worked without an issue, and when he gave a signal to advance, Galadea and her undead cohorts moved up as well, cutting off all escape routes and forcing small greenskins to try and fight their way to freedom, but their force was so small and poorly equipped that they stood almost no chance of doing so. But obviously, even while fighting against such limited numbers, Arius knew that underestimating cornered goblins would be a perfect recipe for a disaster. They might have been small and individually weak, but in large groups, even goblin Luddites were dangerous, not due to their skills, but due to their very nature, which became evident as one of the groups approached Arius's advancing troops. These were, perhaps, one of the most terrifying things Goblin army could send at you. A bunch of untouchables, weak, scrawny goblins wielding a collection of rusty weapons and wearing almost no armor or even basic clothes. At a glance, they seemed like a pathetic meat shield, but combat prowess was not their main forte. Instead, the screeching green wave rushed towards you, and you often could smell them before even realizing they were there. And then, as they got closer, you realized that their name was not some mark of social status. No, the Untouchables were called like that because even being in close proximity to them was a recipe for a painful, sickening death. These greenskins carried every single disease known in civilized world, and probably quite a lot of unknown ones, and their mangled, disfigured bodies were pretty much biological weapons by themselves. Oozing some indescribable filth from their self-inflicted wounds, these creatures were themselves immune to any kind of sickness, but their very presence polluted the air and forced even bravest soldiers to step back in disgust. So it came as no surprise that, when they were spotted, Arius ordered all of his men to keep a healthy distance and fight from range, although by then everyone was already sickened by foul smell that could be felt even 100 meters away. What's worse, even decimated by arrows and bullets, the remaining Untouchables charged forward without showing even a single sign of being afraid, for their bodies, already mangled and broken, possessed extremely high resistance to pain, as their nerves were already fried by disease. Which, unfortunately, meant that soon they managed to get close enough to Arius's soldiers to throw bits of their own sickening flesh at them, amongst other things that will not be described here, which, while not very deadly at first, could spread their filth like plague amongst all men in the army in matter of mere minutes. But Metzacans had a little surprise in store on their own, in form of the necromancer who, once again, had a chance to prove her usefulness and her special abilities to her comrades. For as her undead minions swarmed a company of goblin slingers and tore it apart in mindless rage, Galladay and her hooded followers suddenly vanished without a trace, only to reappear amongst the tents from an unexpected angle from which they charged at the goblin commander and his retinue. And it wasn't even a fight. Miss Pireni simply rode through the goblins at the head of her formation without stopping, and by the time she broke through, the greenskins lied shattered on the ground in pools of their own blood. And that was pretty much it. Surrounded by a wall of Metzacan steel on one side and a mass of undead flesh on another, the goblins could only throw themselves into a hopeless fight, clearly too afraid of surrendering. The slingers perished without accomplishing anything of note, but the Untouchables, as was said, managed to throw their rotten flesh at some colonial soldiers, who were then forced to drop their weapons, tear bits of nearby ashen trees and set them on fire, to cauterize places in which they were struck by diseased attacks, before the rot could take hold. But that was it. Few minutes later, the last remaining goblins were pinned to the ground with a deadly barrage of arrows, and the camp was secured. Then, a handful of Tigran heads appeared from the tents, followed closely by even more of them. Upon seeing that, Rajal rushed on ahead to meet his people and tell them about the human prince who made this rescue mission possible, while in the meantime, Arius and his men started to tear down the camp and rummaging through goblin belongings to find a clue about their operations. For it was obvious that these greenskins were just a small part of a larger organization, and as long as it was out there, Tigran people would not be safe. Still, at the very least their abductions were interrupted now, and Arius even ordered his men to tear down the lighthouse that could guide more slaver ships into the cove. But as the tower was toppled, a few more figures appeared on the horizon, approaching from inland. At first, everyone believed them to be more goblins due to similar size, but a quick glance through a spyglass proved that these were, in fact, dwarves. And wherever they were dwarves, Crimson Star Company was never too far behind. Still, when the bearded ones saw the fallen tower, they immediately turned back, and Lord Governor sent a few scouts after them to find out where they operated from. And at the same time, Arius was approached by Raja and his people, a company of Tigran warriors who now, together with their commander, swore to serve Arius as a form of gratitude for freeing them from a life of inevitable slavery, or, if a certain clue found by Galadea was to be believed, even something worse. Of course, not every Tigran joined Metzacan forces. Most of them were after all civilians, so they were sent back to the shore, where Captain Yarohin was ordered to load them onto transport barges and get them safely to their island. Of course, that meant that Metzacans were now stuck here for at least a month or two, but Arius was not in a hurry to get back home. The presence of this camp, as well as the clue found by Galadea, meant that local dwarves had some explaining to do, and Arius' scouts soon came back with the news that they even had an entire town at the top of the large hill in the middle of the island. So that's where Lord Governor went, with both his men and a bunch of angry Tigran warriors in tow. And they were determined to get their answers, even if they had to spill a river of blood to get them, but there was no way such a thing would be necessary. These were dwarves after all, known for their reasonable approach to everything. Nothing could go wrong there, right? Alright, that's enough. You've been keeping us waiting here for almost 2 hours. This is no longer a time for preparations, but a diplomatic insult. We're going in. Move aside, dwarf. Move aside, good sir, before I'm forced to move you myself. Thank you. Ah, Lord Governor Erigen, what a pleasant surprise to see you here. Ranulf Carrodus, at your service. Please accept my deepest apologies for the long wait, but I was extremely busy with my other duties. Spare me your theatrics, dwarf. You know full well I was waiting outside all this time, but you chose to ignore us, no doubt to hide all evidence of your criminal actions. I assure you that this is not the case, Lord Governor. I have indeed been informed that you have arrived, but the messenger also said that you were looking for a person in charge of this settlement, and since this is an independent town, unaffiliated with any continental or other powers, I assumed you went to see the mayor. If I wanted to talk to a mindless frontman, I would do it, but I'm here for you and you specifically. It doesn't take a genius to realize that this town is run by Crimson Company, and I've been told that you're the one responsible for their operations here. So you're not getting rid of us that easily, not when you're responsible for kidnappings of Tiharan people. Tiharan? Oh, you mean the cat people, of course, and... oh dear me, I see you also brought one of them with you. Blessings of the twin moons upon you, friend. I believe this is a proper greeting in official situations like this? Only between friends and allies, small one, and you are neither. The only welcome we have for thieves and kidnappers is at the end of a blade. I see. However, I must say that I am a bit confused about your implications. I have no idea what kidnappings you're talking about. Don't try to weasel yourself out of this, dwarf. We know that your ships dropped at least several mercenary companies on Tiharan Island to capture them. In fact, we tracked one of these companies to this very island and found not only them but Tiharans themselves, locked up in a camp like cattle, waiting to be transported back to the continent. I don't know what to say. I'm afraid I have no knowledge of any camp or operations like the one you mentioned. Maybe the mercenaries simply posed as our people to draw your attention away from them? Really? Even now you are still lying. We know you're involved with this because we found a letter on a commander of these goblins. A letter signed and stamped with the seal of your company board. Here, take a look. How will you explain this? Impossible. Let me see. Hereby contracted, nonsense, to procure specimens of Tiharan. Oh, Sigismund, you mindless fool, you should have known better. Gentlemen, I am afraid there has been a terrible misunderstanding. This document is indeed signed by a member of the board, an elf by the name of Sigismund Gelrig, a rather young new member, one who is sadly prone to certain overblown ambitions. However, I must add that this document has not been sanctioned, and no wonder since no other member of the board would ever approve such a mindless idea. And let me tell you, this is perhaps one of the most outrageous misuses of power I have ever seen. I will send a message back home immediately so that the board can arrest Mr. Gelrig and seize all of his funds and assets. That's it? You throw your competitor into the line of fire and think that's enough to repay his crimes? Of course not. I will use all my available assets to ensure that every single Tiharan will safely return home. I will also petition the board to send you all of Gelrig's financial assets as a form of recompensation. I do not want his gold. I want his head. I'm afraid that is impossible, good sir. Gelrig is our board member, so the board will judge him by itself. But worry not, he will not walk out of this. He not only misused his authority, he also tarnished our reputation and reduced our potential profits we could have earned from trade with your people. He will spend the rest of his life, and a long part of unlife as well, walking out his debts for this. But I can see that you're still not satisfied. Very well then, allow me to offer one more thing as a sign of goodwill. The company will relinquish all claims on this island and remove all assets from here. I wish I could simply transfer the settlement under your leadership, but I'm afraid even I lack the means to do so. But I'm sure that together with Lord Governor here you'll be able to work something out. I will even give you the promise on paper and stamp it with board seal, so you know I'm not just throwing empty promises. Sound good? No, but I doubt that we can get anything more out of you. But what do you think, Arius? Can we trust him? Not in the slightest, but we should take the deal nonetheless. As you said, we probably won't get anything else here. Very well then, Mr. Carodus, we accept your offer. Splendid. I will prepare the document immediately. In the meantime, if you could wait downstairs, I will order someone to bring you some refreshments. Thank you, gentlemen. Alright lads, you can come out now. Thanks for arriving on such a short notice. My, what a fancy little idea you have here. Guards in the walks, ready to jump into action at the very first sign of danger. Ingenious. What the... Where are my men? Oh, they're asleep. At least I hope so. I might have messed something up with my special drink. But let's get to the point, shall we? I saw you eyeing up our lovely prince with that greedy look in your eyes. You want to use him, and not in a fun way, but I need him to help me out with something, so consider this visit a warning. Do not dare to interfere with his plans, or you will have to go through me. Point taken. But who exactly are you? Someone you do not want to mess with. Also, someone who is no longer here. Toodles! Impressive, I have to say, and potentially very problematic. Now I see why our friend from Muzaka warned us about this woman.